Open Market is sponsored by Adlib, the self-serve DSP solution making advertising easy. What do the world's largest demand-side platforms have in common? They're effective, but they require large annual contracts and spend minimums. With Adlib, growing agencies get a single platform that connects to every top global DSP with no contracts, no spend minimums, and G2's #1 ranked support. That means access to the entire universe of TV, digital out-of-home, audio, display, video, and native without a hassle and with no blind spots. It's incredibly easy to use, plus it can automate most of the work your team spends hours a day doing manually. Get the most powerful media buying technology without the barriers to entry. Check out Adlib at getadlib.com today.
How's it going?
Good. You still in LA?
I am, yeah. I'm coming up on my last week here. I'm back next Saturday.
Are you cool with all these wildfires and stuff?
Yeah, they're not near me, so it's a very weird situation because it's like everyone's like, the whole city is burning, but I'm like, yes, but also look at what I have. It's very nice.
Yeah, for the listeners, Joe just showed me his view, and it's beautiful.
Oh, we are recording.
We flip it live right away.
Okay, I like it. Yeah, that's better. Well, yeah, so I've been in LA for the month. I have one more week here. When you're listening, I guess I'll have come back to New York a week before. And the wildfires are a very weird disaster because obviously I feel horrible for the people affected, and I know that includes people in our industry. At the same time, it's bizarre because it's like 2 days after the worst of the Palisades and Eaton fires. Like the rest of LA, a lot of it feels pretty normal. I know there's some like particulate matter in the air or whatever, but you wouldn't know anything had happened if you hadn't read the news. So yeah, very bizarre, but it looks like the worst of those fires is over. And yeah, fortunately, I was in part of the city that wasn't affected.
For the listener, we decided a couple of pods ago that some of the best material happens right before we hit record. So we're hitting record as soon as Joe opens up a Zoom, and sometimes it's going to be serious matters like this. Usually it's going to be a lot of witty banter that you just don't have the privilege of hearing.
Yeah, usually you're just missing me making fun of Eric. So yeah, today we started on a different note.
I got something for you to make fun of. Do you like my sweater, Joe?
I wouldn't call that a sweater. I guess that's what a finance bro might call a sweater.
Okay, I'm wearing a Patagonia zip up, a full zip up. It's a moat sweater. I was thinking this morning, I'm not sure exactly when Jonah gave this to me. It's probably circa like early teens, right? So like maybe it was like 2012, 2013. And I was thinking about your age. You might have been in high school when I received this sweater.
I graduated in 2013. Yeah.
It was right on the bubble.
Okay, I'll do one more not unserious anecdote, which is Brian O'Kelly was in my dream yesterday. So Brian is a client of mine. I had a dream that I was at like an Adtech conference and I was like having a bunch of meetings and whatever. And then I like ran into Brian. He's talking to me about like acquiring a DSP or something. I don't know if it made any sense. Maybe I need to tell him this because like God is telling me that Brian needs to do that. And then we hopped on a private jet and we went somewhere else, but it wasn't very far. It was like the private jet was Brian's shuttle to the other like part of the event or something like that, which also I believe Brian is on the record as being against private jets because of, scope emissions, sustainability and whatever. But in my dreams, what I wish for Brian is a future where he's acquiring DSPs and taking private jets from one part of an event to another and taking me along. So I'm just going to put that out into the universe. Brian, you consider that on your own time. We'll talk about it.
Amazing. All right. Well, for the listener, welcome to Open Market. Today we have no guest. It's Joe and me. So what we wanted to do was talk through a couple of topics that we've been tracking for some time, and we thought it'd be interesting to dive into. So, you want to get started?
Yeah, so the first one was attention. Obviously, I talk about attention a lot. One of my stock arguments is that this is what's wrong with a lot of B2B and in particular ad tech marketing is that they don't do, like B2B marketing programs aren't set up to do the number one thing, which is orchestrate attention. And I made the point before, to me, this is like it's not an ideological decision to put attention first. It's like a sort of metaphysical question. It's like you literally can't do anything from a marketing perspective if you don't start by getting the attention of your audience, right? So first we need to think about how we earn their attention, and then we can do all the things marketing does, which is, drive trust, differentiation, and urgency. We can't do any of those three things, though, if no one is paying attention to us. And I was listening recently to an episode of the Ezra Klein pod that he did with Chris Hayes. And ostensibly, they're talking about politics and how attention in politics has shifted, and how central it is to obtaining influence and winning elections. But I sent it to Eric because this shift in the way attention works and the primacy of attention nowadays is not exclusive to politics. And what I think has changed about it is 20 years ago, the amount of attention you could obtain, there was less variance because it went through third-party gatekeepers. So it was like, there was 60 Minutes, CBS had its programs, ABC had its programs, there were the cable news shows, there was the New York Times. And all you could really do as a political actor was to get more attention from these people. And even then, you didn't have control over how they spoke about you. Whereas nowadays, and we see this in the business world as well, there is a drastic spectrum of the amount of attention you can command. And when you command that attention through first-party communication channels like social, email, and audio, you can also control the tone of it. So sort of how you're communicating, and often even how you're being talked about, whom you're choosing to talk to, like whether you're going to individual podcasts and social creators instead of the media. So the gamut of attention outcomes has shifted drastically, has become much broader over the last 10 or so years. And that makes optimizing for attention a much higher leverage opportunity that you can exploit in politics and in business.
So you sent me this episode. We should link to it or point to it somewhere in the show notes. I'd never listened to that podcast before. I'd read Ezra's stuff, but I'd never listened to that. Are you a regular listener to that podcast?
Yes. Caught red-handed, New York City lib, just listening to Ezra Klein on the regular. So it's like, we don't get that in rural New Jersey. In the beach house community, it's Rush Limbaugh's ghost all day, every day.
Okay, I don't listen to Rush Limbaugh, but I had never listened to that podcast. I felt like there was a lot of inside jokes that I just wasn't part of. I wasn't privy to. It felt weird. I almost felt alienated. They talked about, Joe Rogan and people who listen to the Joe Rogan podcast. And I listened to Rogan. It was actually odd, but I appreciated hearing a differing point of view because, we'll talk about attention in a second, more of a commentary that's related to it. I think because our algos are so tuned to our tastes now as a, middle-aged man who listens to Joe Rogan, I then go down the rabbit hole of being, served content and discovering things that are, kind of like what people that listen to Joe Rogan listen to, which I think has reflected a lot of like my media consumption tastes, maybe not the decisions and everything like that. But this was like a world that I wasn't a part of and like conversations that I wasn't a part of. It was fascinating. And I appreciate you like sending this to me. And I'm going to listen to it just for a different point of view.
Let me touch on that because I think that's super interesting. Like what you essentially experienced while listening to the pod, the like silos of the information ecosystem, and you were like, "Oh, I'm the people you're talking about who are like not super tapped into the like DC political information sphere."
Yeah, I felt like I wasn't in the club, like I wasn't one of the cool kids. It was an experience, and I appreciated it. I wouldn't have been in that room, so to speak, if it wasn't for you. Anyway, back to attention. So they made a lot of interesting points. I really enjoyed this thing, but the big ones were attention is more valuable than money in a weird way, right? Because the latter is kind of abundant, right? Particularly if we're thinking about this in the context of politics, where, all candidates typically have a lot of money to deploy against marketing. were attention because it's, basically amount of attention you can generate or garner of people's like mind space based on the channels they're on. Attention is inherently scarce. So it's like in 2025, attention is arguably like more valuable than money, which is kind of mind blowing. And they also kind of showed that, Musk and Trump, sidebar, obviously they're super rich. They're proof of this in that, what they're doing, particularly on like first party channels, you can't buy that stuff. Like you need to generate the attention. The other thing they said that I thought was kind of interesting was that more attention is better. And this is something that, I felt uncomfortable in my mind, like agreeing with. And this is what I want to talk to you in the context of like B2B marketing. What does this mean for SaaS, right? What does this mean for B2B SaaS? It's like more attention is better. And even negative attention is better because this whole game is about garnering attention. So it doesn't even matter. It's like the old adage, any publicity is good publicity. If people are talking about you, if you are talking to people, it's all good. And I understand that in the context of like mainstream media and politics, but is that really true in B2B marketing?
Yeah, let's take it as 3 points. So Eric's identifying 3 different points from the show. One is attention is greater than money. 2 is more attention is better, even if it's negative. And 3 is attention has new orchestrators and centers of power. So working backwards, this one is my constant shtick. Attention has new orchestrators and centers of power. Like they say on the pod, Democrats are very old fashioned. They're essentially like your like 50-year-old CEO or your like 50-year-old CMO. And they're like,
hey.
Yeah.
Just kidding. I'm not there yet.
Taking friggin' shots. And they think that like the political version of that is that you think the way you obtain influence and attention is like, well, we got to give a speech or we got to go like talk to the guy on MSNBC.
Or buy some ads, right? Take this, hundreds of millions of dollars that we've raised and buy some TV ads and radio ads.
Right, exactly. And I think ads are like a little more viable, but yeah, the people my age, I think it's almost like, what do you even mean you're giving a speech? Like what is that like an Instagram video you give at a podium? How does it happen? Who's there? And so, yeah, it's like, but the same thing applies to B2B. So, this is my constant thing. It's like in 20 years ago, really, if you wanted to raise awareness about a company, like if you read Benioff's book about Salesforce, he will talk about how he had like 20 reporters and he was like, I'm going to build relationships with these reporters and then they're going to cover me and tell their audiences about me. And that's how I built Salesforce from a brand perspective. And that's just a small piece of the puzzle now. Like the people who do this best, they're not primarily relying on earned media and the traditional centers of attention orchestration. They're taking the message into their own hands. So that's 1. 2, attention is greater than money. I think like people would contest that at first, but if you think about it, think about how much money big brands blow on bad marketing. Like you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars on shitty marketing. And we see that in the political sphere and the business sphere. You can think about like Bloomberg running for president, spent a lot of money on it, and he's significantly richer than Trump, I imagine. Trump is much better at orchestrating attention and developing an authentic connection with people, which also at that point gets to like, how do you actually generate attention? And I think the way Trump does it is a combination of authenticity, like it's a good messenger. People believe that he believes the stuff he's saying. They relate to him. They think he's for them. And then number 2 is he's on a crusade. Trump is, I stand for these people. We are upset about this part of the status quo, and we are against X, Y, and Z. And that's something I think you can take into B2B. I think the best B2B messengers, like think about the Vanderhooks, right? They're very clear. We are on the buy side. We stand with the advertisers, and they are getting ripped off by the walled gardens on one hand, like Google and Meta, especially Google, not actually driving incremental outcomes, and larger DSPs on the other hand, who are taking exorbitant take rates and not investing in innovation, yada, yada, yada. Jason Fairchild, TV Scientific, another example, right? Of the Mad Men era is over. Like we should be in the outcomes era, the accountable advertising era. advertisers are getting screwed over by sort of brand partners who are driving frequency and reach, but not actually driving business outcomes. I stand with the advertisers against those people who are ripping them off, and I'm actually going to drive performance/incremental outcomes on their behalf. So I think Trump does that excellently, and that's another lesson to take away. The last one is like more attention is better. I think this is probably true to a point, and then there's like a point of diminishing returns. But I will say this, like the main problem with how B2B organizations see marketing actually is that they don't understand this dynamic between quantity of attention and quality of attention. They are way too concerned about quality of attention when their quantity of attention is already so low. No one is thinking about them. And they are like, but Joe, this blog post, if the 7th paragraph is not optimal, will it hurt us? And I'm like, no one is thinking about you. Our first objective has to be to obtain a certain threshold of attention. And then once we obtain that threshold, then we can start debating the quality of that attention. But so I wouldn't say more attention necessarily better, like ad infinitum, but I would say we have to reach a threshold of attention, and then we can worry about the quality of it.
Got it. I have very little to add there. That was amazing. So my question in the docket, which is basically like, if I go down this line of thinking, do I need to start saying some outlandish shit? And then your answer is no. You need to understand who your people are, be able to articulate, the problem that your people are facing and, what you stand for to help solve that problem, and maintain, some sort of baseline of output. So your attention is not 0 or like 0.1%. It is actually out there with some level of consistency.
Yes, very well said. Yeah, you want to obtain a certain level, a certain threshold of attention, and you also want to make sure you have a narrative that resonates with your core audience. So for you, it might be ad tech entrepreneurs, right?
Yeah.
The people you want to fund. And so Apurium should have its own narrative of, we stand with those people, we want to help you succeed. VC has historically come up short in X, Y, or Z ways, and we are improving on that on your behalf to create a better ecosystem.
Got it. Well, ask any ad tech entrepreneur if VC in general hasn't been too friendly in the category. So I don't have a ton of competition there. All right, that would be awesome. What do we want to talk about next? We want to talk about optimism.
Yeah, I feel like this is a really optimistic moment, and I'm curious, this is where your many, many years more than mine of experience it'd be helpful. So like I got into ad tech in a big way. Like I've been kicking around ad tech and martech for nearly 10 years because I got into it when I was in college through journalism. But, I got into it in a big way, like end of 2021, 2022.
Wow.
Yeah. And so when I was first like going to conferences like in 2022, I was like, oh, everyone's miserable. I was like, this is like a winter. Everyone thinks there's going to be a recession. Like it was bad times. And I'm like, 2025, like, wow, this feels like cocaine and champagne by contrast. I'm like, people are loving it. And I think there are like a few reasons. I think it's like AI is a big one. Like we feel like we're starting to access the next generation defining technology, and that like this will drive a lot of growth in a lot of new companies, a lot of disruption. I do think the Trump administration is driving some optimism. I think people think we're going to have, deregulation, maybe lower corporate taxes, generally like a very business friendly environment. And then the other is that like good news begets good news. So I don't know what your perspective is on this, but my impression is like there's a little bit of copycatting going on where it's like once you see a few big acquisitions, like strategics start looking at the space and thinking like, should we be buying something for $500 million? So those are some things going on, but maybe you can put it into context of like where we are in the ad tech hype cycle.
I agree. There's been a vibe shift. When we were just thinking back into CES, we were both at CES. It was one of the first questions we asked Tim Vanderhook, and Tim is a pretty steady, pragmatic person. And, he said the vibes are really good, right? In terms of his customer conversations, even some of the climate around Q1. So yeah, for sure, there's been a vibe shift. Like my partner Joe Zawatsky, other Joe, he tends to point to like, there's like 7-year cycles in ad tech, which I haven't really mapped that to 2025 versus 2018. But for sure, this is the most optimism, I think, generally speaking, and then specific to our industry that I can point to in the time that we've been doing the fund, right? So we started doing the fund coincidentally 7 years ago, 2018. We launched it, yeah, and B in just in a long time. So I think your general sense of the vibes are good is there, and I would agree that everything changes when strategics start lining up and writing checks. Number one, it generates some excitement. Number two, it starts, everybody getting excited across the industry, and it just signifies, change and things moving. So I would agree that there's a unusually positive vibe and sense of optimism out there right now. I think the interesting thing about AI, however, is for me it's very exciting, right? Like during times of we had Mike Bishop on, and by the time people listen to this, that'll have been posted. He's like the best times in ad tech are during platform shifts, which I thought was a very, 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 very strong statement, good line, and it's true. But with AI, it's both like platform shift and technology shift. So it's the biggest thing we've ever seen. And I think we're still in the early stages of I wouldn't even call it hype cycle, but the value creation. We're going to see incredible gains and incredible things happen. And on the other side of it, we're going to start to see, I think, real disruption that is going to be whatever the opposite of optimism is with respect to organizational size, organizational changes, where jobs start to move. But, we're, I think, right at the beginning of a cycle of like real optimism.
Yeah, I think AI is the main force, right? And it's driving a sense that things could look very different 5 years from now. 3 years ago, before the current AI hype cycle, if you said to someone like, well, is anything gonna change in terms of the biggest DSPs or whatever, or like, is Google's dominance at all in question? I think people would have said no. They would have basically said like, there's really no force, no paradigm shift in view that's going to change that dynamic. And now there is, right? Like people, I'm having conversations with a lot of ad tech founders and executives who are saying, would I bet against, TTD or Google? No, not necessarily, but there could be a new company created that will over the long term achieve that kind of scale in terms of their own advertising business. And those companies will need to evolve significantly in order to keep pace.
Who would have thought back in 2021, 2022, when you first got into the space, that Google would see like, multiple percentage points of search decline? It's happening. It's all happening right now. It's all starting right now. So I agree. It's the combination of, this AI wave, some of the strategic M&A, the kind of anti-regulation climate that we're probably going to be heading into over the course of the next 4 years. I would agree that the vibe shift is real. All right, let's keep it going. Number 3.
Know your worth versus build your worth. This is a little rant of mine. This is something I think about sometimes. I think like Eric, you're an entrepreneur. I own my own business. Like any of us who have done that, we have like chips on the shoulder and like things of when people, didn't believe in us or whatever that motivate us. And one of my stock didn't believe in me or rejected me stories is 3 to 4 years ago, I was writing a newsletter that I think would have taken, it was essentially a half-time job. I think it would have taken the average person like 4 hours a day to do. It took me a little less because I'm a fast writer, and I was getting paid $3K a month to do that. And I asked the owner of the business, which was in like an education/news nonprofit, if he would give me a raise from $3,000 a month to $3,650. And he said,
such a specific number.
because I had like run some sort of course, in the way you do when you're in that position, you're like running some sort of calculation about why it's justified. And then I remember he was said, don't get ahead of yourself. Or he said, I think you're getting ahead of yourself or something like that, which is obviously particularly loaded language in that it's like, you are not worth that, or like you're, you have an inflated ego to be asking for this. So obviously that hurt. And I ended up quitting that job. That was right around the time I was starting to get into marketing more seriously. And I did see at that time, I was like, okay, journalism is really rough as a job market, or a place to try to build any kind of business. Marketing, obviously, there's a lot more opportunity. And so I got into marketing seriously around that time. And, within 12 months, I was like making several multiples of, whatever I had requested from that guy. Yeah. Well, and obviously now I do a lot better than that, but because my business has grown a lot over the last few years. But my point in bringing this up is, on the one hand, yes, this is like the sort of classic entrepreneur story that motivates you. You think about it, you're like, oh, I like built a business that was so much bigger than, this little raise I was requesting. But on the other hand, now I am a business owner and, I have a couple employees and I see it from that guy's perspective. And I actually think, it might have been worth it to him to give me that raise because I was doing a really good job, and that's not really a crazy amount of money. But I also understand why he said no, because your value in any organization, and this goes whether you're full-time or you're a consultant or whatever, is based on the environment. It's contextual. It's about how that business is performing. It's about the type of work you're doing and what sort of value you can contribute to that organization. It's about the broader business environment that company is participating in. So, like, yes, he could have granted me the raise from $3,000 to $3,650 a month, but thinking big picture, like, he couldn't have paid me $7,000 a month. He couldn't have paid me multiples of what I was asking. And I probably would have left anyway, because the marketing stuff was taking off. And I was going to probably realize anyway, within 6 to 12 months of that conversation, that there was a lot more money to be made and a much bigger business opportunity by diving into the ad tech marketing thing. And so I often talk to people, friends, colleagues. I see stuff on LinkedIn where people are talking about the sort of business maxim, know your worth. And it always sort of rubs me the wrong way. And I think that's because the phrase tends to be deployed in a way that suggests you have some sort of universal or intrinsic worth in the business environment, which as a human being, yes. In the business context, no. Like, your worth is entirely premised on what you can contribute to a given organization. And that depends on how big the organization is, what industry it is it nonprofit or for-profit, and what kind of work you're doing and how rare the type of value you're delivering is. So to me, it's a story that points to the fallacy of know your worth and the importance of instead looking at it logically and building your worth for a specific audience. Because I think like what I've done since is I went all in on ad tech and developed a specific marketing angle on like the ad tech ecosystem. And now I offer a non-commoditized form of value to also a much more valuable form of organization, which is, ad tech CEOs, often CEOs of like quite large companies. And so what they pay me, even if they pay me 5 times what I was asking that guy to pay me, it's a drop in the bucket. And also I can generate, millions of dollars of value for them in terms of driving pipeline for the big deals that they do.
Do you remember before the end of the year, we had that pod where I turned you on to Naval Ravikant?
Yes.
And then like your mind was blown and you saw his posted his pin tweet, how to get rich without getting lucky. Again, I'm weird. And again, I blame the algorithms for training my brain this way, but like, I just have like a set of media that I enjoy. And this is all in this kind of, I don't know, Naval genre. He's got that pinned thread, how to get rich without getting lucky. Everybody should read it. And, within the thread, there's one tweet that, basically summarizes exactly what you're saying. And it starts by arm yourself with specific knowledge, accountability, and leverage. Specific knowledge, next tweet, is knowledge you cannot be trained for. If society can train you, if it can train someone else and replace you. So it's incredible. Like if you just walk through like exactly where you ended up, very specific knowledge in a very specific niche, the accountability of, owning your own business, and the leverage that you've created through media, through your presence, through the ability to kind of, have this stuff travel, infinitely through the internet. Like you're the Naval tweet.
Yeah, that's the Naval brilliance as he captures these lessons in like 7-word tweets. But yeah, and it points to another thing. Like I often talk to people, like I'm going to be 30 this year, and so I often talk to friends who are they're like me. They're like 8 years into their careers, but obviously most of them don't own their own business. They're probably like middle managers at like a big corporation in a given industry, and they often are wondering, should I move into a new industry? Because people just get antsy. They're like, I've been doing this for 8 years. Maybe I want to do something else. I think that's like a very human reaction to like get antsy and want to like see if the grass is greener on the other side. And my instinct is usually no. Not that you shouldn't switch companies or pursue a different opportunity, but I think most people, they quit on an industry way too fast, and they underexploit and underestimate the amount of leverage and compounding value that they can extract or build by sticking in an industry and developing a great deal of that specific knowledge. And I've seen that with Adtech. It's like there is probably a point where, if I wanted to build the marketing agency to the moon, like I would have to go into other verticals, but I'm nowhere near that point yet. And you are so much more valuable if in a sales call with an ad tech CEO, you can say, I'm also working with these other 5 ad tech CEOs. I'm seeing the industry from their vantage point. Here are my thoughts on your company in the space, right? You know a ton even before talking to them. You can provide context. You have relationships. You've seen this with Aperium. This is essentially the strategy you and Joe have taken with the firm from the VC angle. And I think most people quit on that advantage of staying put in an industry and developing a very deep level of knowledge too quickly.
Yeah, well said. And when you're in those rooms talking about other customers and things that you've done, that's where the accountability factor comes into play, right? You can have the specific knowledge, but then you can also point to, hey, I've done this stuff. And I think it all plays into where you've brought your career today. All right, one more thing and we'll call it a day. So there's this quote: there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. I heard that once, and it sort of always stuck in my mind. And maybe this is tied to this, optimism of the moment and everything that's going on in the world, in the space. But there was a moment 2 weeks ago where I was like, this is the week where decades happened. We were off the heels of T-Mobile acquiring Vistar. We had just seen the acquisition of Sincera by TTD. So you had, a brand new strategic entrant to the space. So, T-Mobile has always been, around, and they've kind of quietly built an interesting business, but they put a stake in the ground and they wrote a really big check, a $500 million check, right? So like the emergence of a new strategic, for a while, we were waiting to see who it would be. So number one, the emergence of the new strategic. And then, number two, you had the strategic, arguably like one of, if not the most important independent company in ad tech, making what most observers, yourself included, can be argued to be a very strategic acquisition of Sincera, one that could shift the chessboard a little bit. And it all happened at once. It kind of sandwiched in the middle. Like we had, a couple of companies in the portfolio raise a Series A. Like the Series A market is unfreezing to a degree. So it's like maybe this 7-year thing is starting to come together. And Particle was acquired by Rocked. I was sitting there and I was like, man, it was like those 7 years all just kind of came together, and we took a leap forward in terms of progress and momentum over the course of 7 days. And, maybe this is, again, to the point earlier, kind of sign of the time, so to speak, right? Of these data points of optimism. Maybe it's just underscoring that like literally it takes 7 years for these changes to happen and, kind of interesting things to come together. But I don't know, kind of feels like these past couple of weeks, said a different way, are the weeks where decades have happened.
Yeah, we had three very significant acquisitions in short order, right? It was TDD Sincera, T-Mobile, Vistar, and Rockdem Particle, 300 million, 600 million, and the TDD Sincera.
Other than more.
Yeah, conceptually very interesting.
We were happy. We were happy with it.
Yeah. I think it also, what you're saying, Eric, speaks to another like business cliche that is so important to remember, which is like nothing is ever as good or as bad as you think it is. Like there were periods where it felt like no significant ad tech acquisition will ever happen again. And, it's like there will never be another like super valuable ad tech company. Obviously, you didn't believe that because that's the thesis of your firm. But people start to believe things like that when there's a winter, right? And when there's like a couple years where there isn't a lot of M&A activity and there aren't any, people aren't aware of any big companies being founded because they're not exiting. So yeah, it's never like in those moments, it's never as bad as people think it is. But then it's also a reminder during the peak of the hype cycle to also vet things and not get into the pets.com level of hysteria where you're like, everything will, turn into a successful exit and we've got to back all the things. I will say though, Adtech has a pessimistic vibe as far as tech sectors go. Like people are very skeptical, or maybe pessimistic's too strong and we could say skeptical. Like take AI, like the disposition of the ad tech ecosystem is not to be like, oh my God, AI is amazing and we're going to create all these like $1 billion like AI driven ad tech companies. It's like, is this real? And like who's, show me the proof and like all that kind of stuff. Whereas I think like the Silicon Valley, we were talking about this with Mike Bishop, the Silicon Valley ecosystem has a much more optimistic, like, we're all going to create $1 billion companies and it's going to be amazing type of energy. And so I think in ad tech, what we need to remember more often is that like, it's not as bad as it seems. And actually like a lot of value has been created and will be created here. And like, we need to take bets and back things and maybe not be as skeptical of big changes.
I always feel out of place in ad tech because, I've just had this optimistic view that few share, but thankfully that number is growing. One final point and there's a great point you made. One final point on this, both Vistar Media and Imparticle are a reminder that it takes a long time. So Vistar Media, founded in 2011. Imparticle wrote that check in 2012. Like success takes time. So while we're in a moment that's a heater and like a lot of things have come together, talk to Mike and Mike, the two CEOs of Imparticle and Vistar, respectively, about the 14-year journey and 13-year journey, respectively. It took them to get there. These things just take time, man.
Yeah, exactly. Got to be in it for the long haul. And the biggest bets usually take a while to turn out, or at least for their full value to be realized. I think that's a good note to end on.
I agree. Joe, this is fun. Looking forward to having you back on the East Coast.
Yes. When you hear this, I'll be in the cold, freezing, just scurrying from one New York meeting to the next. So thanks a ton, Eric. Guys, like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review. Thank you very much. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye, everybody.